Giving Up the Ghost by Sean Platt and David Wright. Day 3. Mai Oku stared at the caskets in the showroom. They were larger versions of the box she was being asked to select as her child's final resting place. A mother should never have to bury her child, let alone one who had only turned 8 last month. "I can't do it," she said through tears. Her husband, Jin, squeezed her hand gently, which for him was a big deal. The man never showed any emotion greater than that. "It's okay. You can wait outside. I can do this." "No." She blew her nose into a wadded-up clump of damp tissue. "You don't know which one Hisao would have wanted." She could imagine the rest of that sentence. He would say, "It doesn't matter. A casket is a casket, a practical item for a practical purpose, not something where style, comfort or ornamentation mattered." To Jin, a wooden box was no different than a bronze casket with a plush velvet interior. Jin wasn't a cheap man, but he was stubbornly pragmatic. It suited him well for his job as secretary to the ministry, not so much for matters of the heart. "No, I want to pick it out." She forced herself to walk over to one of the caskets. A chill ran through her when she brushed her fingers over the smooth surface of an ornate wooden top. The inside was a light blue, Hisao's favourite colour. "That is the mahogany casket, a popular choice with parents," said the funeral director. She turned around to look at him. His name was Stephen. She remembered that much. How many children had to die to make a casket popular? She wanted to ask. But forming words, let alone sentences, was hard at the moment. Needless conversation was even worse. Stephen was tall, blonde and young, in his 30s. She was annoyed by his presence and wished that funeral homes had transitioned to AI and hologram customer service like other places. Unfortunately, funeral homes prided themselves on being one of the few businesses that still required a personal touch. Stephen seemed far too young to be handling something as delicate as her son's funeral. Weren't funeral directors typically old men? "This is a nice one," Jin said, perhaps sensing her discomfort. Hisao liked blue. She wondered if Jin remembered that, or if he was merely guessing and wanted to get out of here as quickly as she did. "Let me tell you about this model," Stephen said. Model? Were they buying a casket or a car? Mai felt a tightness in her chest and a sudden need to flee the room. "I'm sorry, do you have somewhere I can sit?" "Of course," Stephen said. He gestured to the door and she followed him out and down the hallway to another room. It had low lighting, a few chairs, nothing more. Jin followed. "Do you want to be alone?" "Yes." She nodded. "Go ahead and buy the casket." He nodded, then stood for a moment. Stephen cleared his throat. A moment later, Jin followed him out, letting the door close quietly behind him. But Mai was no longer alone. Hisao sat in a chair opposite her. "What are you doing here?" she asked. "This isn't a place for children." "What sort of place is it?" He stood looking around the room. "And how did I get here?" He'd been dead for 2 days. And still, both times she'd seen him, once at home and another time at a store, he had no idea he was a ghost. She'd heard stories of children's souls staying around after death, not realizing they were dead, that it was the parents' obligation to tell them. But how do you tell your child that he's dead? So she hadn't. She couldn't. She wouldn't. Instead, Mai just talked with him, doing her best to hide her tears. "Where are we?" Hisao asked. "Your father is buying something," she said. She waited for him to ask more. He didn't. Instead, he shivered. "It's cold." Mai got to her feet, walked over to the temperature gauge. "Let me turn it up." She fiddled with the switch, but it was locked. "There, that should be better. Now what did you do today?" He paused, a finger to his mouth as he sometimes did. Weird. I can't remember. Do you remember what I did?" "Yes, you went to school," Mai said, sitting again. "Oh yeah, I guess so. I can't quite remember." He looked at the ground, pacing, grabbing at his thick, dark hair in frustration. Why can't I remember? I don't know, she said, fighting her tears. I'm still cold. He came forward and leaned over her for warmth. He was wearing jeans and his favourite blue and yellow long-sleeved shirt, one he'd picked because he thought it looked cool. Mai swallowed, feeling the cold chill of his spirit. His head and arms passed through her instead of coming to rest on her shoulder, and bolted back. What's happening? He looked down at his hands. Why can't I touch you? She lost the war with her tears and cried, I'm sorry. What's wrong? He screamed. The door flew open. Jin ran in, looking at Mai. And then he spotted Hisao. His eyes widened. Mai was certain this was the first time Jin had seen his son since he died. Dad, what's wrong with Mum? Hisao asked. But Jin didn't answer, simply stood there staring. Hisao ran to him, then through him. Stopping just on the other side of the doorway, turning to look back, realization slowly dawning on his face. He vanished. And Mai broke down. Stephen planted his hands on his hips, staring at them. Gone was the amenable look on his face. He was now a mix of annoyed and angry. Your son is still with you? You haven't called bereavement services yet? Mai froze, not wanting to admit that no, she hadn't called bereavement services. And yes, she knew she could get in trouble. But it was none of Stephen's business. Surely he'd met others before who had delayed the call. This was a child, for God's sake. Her child. Surely no one could blame her for holding off, despite the dangers. I see. He nodded, pressing his lips together. I can call bereavement services for you. I've done it before. No, that won't be necessary, Jin said, reaching into his jacket pocket. He retrieved his ID card and held it out to Stephen. H class. One of the highest rankings for government officials. Apologies, sir and ma'am. I'll give you two some time alone. You can sign the paperwork whenever you're ready, sir. Thank you, Jin said. Stephen closed the door softly, leaving them alone. I thought you called them, Jin said. No, I've been busy going through Hisao's things, and I just didn't think to. It was a lie, and a thin one at that. But perhaps it was also the sort of lie her husband would want to believe. It made it easier to think the matter had indeed slipped her mind rather than the alternative, that she didn't want to make the call, that she wasn't ready to give up her son's ghost. Is this the first time you've seen him? Yes, she lied again. What did he say? He was confused, scared. He said he was cold and asked where we were. So he didn't know? No, she burst into tears, and I couldn't tell him. Jin hugged her. The sort of hug he used to give earlier in their marriage before work consumed his heart and time. It's going to be okay. I'll call tonight. No, she said, I'll do it tomorrow. He pulled out of the hug and met her gaze. Are you sure? I don't mind. Number? If he comes back, I want to explain what happened. He ought to know before they snatch him up. Jin looked like he was going to argue, but then he gave a slight nod. You have to promise to call tomorrow. I promise. Another lie. Day 4. Jin was at work and Mai in her home office, surfing the internet, looking for anything of interest to occupy her mind, so she didn't have to think of Hisao or the phone calls she was supposed to be making. Her Live Life profile wall was full of condolences from friends, distant relatives and former co-workers, people she'd been close to before she quit her job 2 years earlier, following her husband's promotion. So many messages from people she'd not spoken to in that time. Not one of them had called since she left, not even after her son died. Yet here they were, posting to her wall like they were best of friends. It was almost as if some social contract required them to say something publicly, even a bare minimum on social media. Yet if they truly cared, they would have called or come by the house. She hated their artificial words, and she hated them. She clicked off the page, shut off her computer, staring at her reflection in the dark monitor. Then she heard giggling. He sows. She sat upright, listening for the sound again. It came from his room. Mai left her office, then approached his door, still ajar from when she'd gone in there this morning to see if he was there. At the time, he hadn't been, and for a few moments she thought she might not have to make the call to bereavement services. But now he was lying on the floor, playing with his toy cars, just like he'd done so many mornings before, supplying the sound effects as they raced one another, skidding off imaginary cliffs and roads. She wondered how he was able to move the cars, but couldn't make physical contact with her. Was it some rule of ghost physics that the world had yet to untangle? It had only been 10 years since ghosts started returning. And ever since then, bereavement services became an important part of people's lives. Yet so much about the process remained unknown. Part of the mystery was that not every soul returned, and those that didn't seem to know very much about their situation. Most of them, like her son, were confused. There were also differing reports of how ghosts reacted upon their return. But there were two seemingly universal truths. One was that ghosts had a maximum of 6 days to sort things out. The second was that on the 7th day, bad things would happen for ghosts who hadn't yet been guided to the afterlife by bereavement services. They became something terrible, something dangerous. And God help those who fell victim to a bad spirit. The spiritual guides at bereavement services claimed to usher the spirits to the other side. But who was to say what they were really doing? How could you usher someone to the other side when you yourself had never been there? Were there different other sides for different faiths? Did each country have their own other side? Each city? It all seemed like a scam to Mai, just another service built to cash in on grief. But most of all, she was terrified that the skeptics were right. There was a growing contingent of critics who claimed that bereavement services weren't guiding the ghosts anywhere. Instead, they were exorcising them, same as they did with the spirits gone bad, that they were actually destroying them, not guiding them to some serene and peaceful afterlife, which they referred to in all the advertisements as the next. Mai watched as Hisao played and wished she could freeze the moment forever. Even if she could never speak to him, just to see him lying on the ground, pushing his toys along, making his adorable little sounds. It warmed her heart in a way it would never be warmed again. Not after he was gone forever. There was a time in her naive youth when Mai couldn't have imagined her life with a child. She was too independent, didn't want the chains. She craved the freedom to do what she wanted when she wanted. She and Jin were alike in that area once upon a time, both of them driven to high-profile careers. He with his government work, and she as an account coordinator at an advertising firm. The only future she saw for herself was making partner, not settling down as a mother. But now she couldn't imagine her life without Hisao. Shortly after his birth, she returned from maternity leave to find someone else had moved up the ladder and landed her job. It left her bitter. But she stuck with the gig another few years in hopes of eventually recovering her prestige. But that never happened. And when Jin was promoted, Mai decided to spend more time being a mother. And suddenly her dreams were for her son. So many times she'd imagined his life and how it might turn out. Would he follow her interest in the arts? Would he go into sports as he seemed to be leaning toward in the past few months after joining a soccer team? Would he go to college, fall in love, meet a nice woman and have a large family? Every year on his birthday, she would interview Hisao in front of a video camera, asking him what he wanted to be when he grew up. At first, he wanted to be a fireman, then a garbage man, then a teacher. Then it was working at an ad firm. So many possibilities. 7 days ago, Mai lay in bed with him, listening as he read the latest book in his favourite series, Jack and the Night Kingdom, Jack's Final Quest. 6 days ago, he'd fallen at school and hit his head. 5 days ago, the school doctor dismissed his injury as a minor bump on the head, even though his brain was swelling. 4 days ago, he died during an operation to relieve that swelling. And just like that, all of his plans were gone. And all of her plans as well. Hisao would never go to school, get married, realize his dreams. Hell, he'd never finish the last book in his favorite series. There was also now a gaping void in Mai's life that she couldn't ever imagine filling. How do you put your life back together after your child dies? Do you go back to work, returning to those people who weren't really your friends? Find a new job in hopes of somehow occupying your mind? But how could anything ever have any significance again in her world? Everything felt meaningless without Hisao. There was nothing left, only an aching pain where her heart once was. She tried to steer herself away from oblivion, told herself to focus on the present. Hisao was here in his room playing, blissfully unaware that he was in some transitory state between life and whatever came next. Now, at least for a little while, Mai still had him. He turned, smiled, popped up, about to run over and hug her as he often did. But she held up a hand quickly, not wanting a repeat of yesterday's horror. "Don't touch. Mummy's not feeling well." He stopped just inches away from her. It hurt to have him so close. But it would hurt worse if he tried to touch her and couldn't. "What's wrong, Mum?" "Just a cold. Nothing for you to worry about." She smiled. "You playing cars?" "Yeah." He leaned down and grabbed a purple one from the carpet. He'd gotten it a few weeks ago at the grocery store. "This one keeps beating all the others and they're getting mad at him." Mai laughed. "Ah, maybe they ought to practice more, just like I tell you to do for tests." "That's what I said." He beamed, his smile cheeky. "But they never listen." She laughed. God, how she'd miss his smile and goofy sense of humour. "Where's Daddy?" he asked. "At work." "What day is it?" It was in fact Monday, but if she told him that, he'd ask why he wasn't in school, and the last thing she wanted was for him to add 2 + 2 and end up with dead. "It's Saturday, he had to go in to help." "Ah, that stinks. I wanted to go to the park with him. Can we go instead?" Mai wasn't sure that was a good idea. Could he even get in the car with her, or would he sink right through? Again with the ghost physics that she didn't understand. And even if they did somehow make it to the park, how long before he tried to talk to someone or people looked at her oddly when she spoke to someone they couldn't see? Or maybe they would see him, but they'd know he was a ghost. Then they'd want to know why she hadn't called bereavement services. Had she ever seen someone else's ghost? She wasn't sure that she had. Maybe it wasn't polite to bring out your ghosts in public. She spotted the book sitting on his nightstand, right where they'd left it before the accident. Mai grabbed it and opened up to the last dogged page. They still had half the novel to go. "How about we read the last Jack book?" "We usually read at night, though." Jack and the Night Kingdom wasn't just his favourite series. They were the first books he had any interest in. He enjoyed school more than most kids, but Hisao initially had no interest in reading. In fact, his reading comprehension had been so poor that his second-grade teacher suggested holding him back a year. But Mai refused to give up on her son. He just hadn't found the right book to light that reading spark in him. All kids could be readers once they found the right stories. So she had taken him to a bookstore and said he could pick out any book he wanted. "Any book?" Hisao asked, already headed toward the graphic novels. Comics were better than nothing, but he would have to also pick out a storybook, one with a lot of words. He looked around, found the first book in the Jack and the Night Kingdom series, and brought it to her. She'd never heard of the series, but later discovered it was hugely popular with kids. The cover had a boy in a scary-looking forest, wearing a glowing green ring to light his way. She couldn't tell if it was a scary book or a fantasy book, but it was age-appropriate, so she bought it. He didn't read the book at first, instead spending a few days on the comic he'd also purchased. The next week he wanted to go back to the bookstore to get the next comic in the series. She said no, not until he read Jack. Reluctantly, and with no small amount of complaining, Hisao agreed, but as he tended to do, he bargained to get something out of the deal. That something was that she would read the story to him. She said no, that defeated the purpose. However, she agreed to read the first chapter, and he the second, and they could go back and forth, reading alternate chapters. Okay, he said, with all the joy of a kid sitting down to a plate of spinach. That night at bedtime, she started reading Jack's story. By the end of the first chapter, Hisao's eyes were wide. Inside them she saw the spark, the one that told her the book had woken a reader within. Jack and the Night Kingdom was a fantastical, funny adventure that they experienced together over the past year and a half. The world, filled with twisty trees full of blue and yellow leaves, colourful homes with misshapen furniture, purple skies and talking animals, had become almost real for them. Jack's friends were their friends. His enemies were their enemies. It was a journey they shared and utterly magical in its transformation of Hisao. Not only did his reading comprehension improve, but he was reading every book he could get his hands on. And while he went on to like many other series, Jack and the Night Kingdom was the first, and it held a special place in both their hearts. So special that when they learned the series was ending with the 6th book, Hisao cried. It was the end of something special. The thought that they might not experience that end together brought a fresh wound to Mai's soul. Perhaps if they read as much as they could finish today. At least Hisao would get to see how the story ended before his story was over as well. But she didn't know how long she'd have with him. His first visit was less than an hour. His other cut short when he realised he wasn't alive. Perhaps with Jin at work, they could spend a few hours together and finish the story. That's true, but don't you want to know how it ends? Yeah, he said, suddenly excited. Great! Mai crawled into bed, scooting all the way to the edge so he wouldn't accidentally touch her. She set the book on his comforter. He grabbed it as he hopped up, then lay on his stomach, propping himself up on his elbows. He opened the book and started to read. She listened as he read the first chapter. They still shared chapter duties. It was their thing. And when he finished, he passed the book to Mai. And she began her turn. She thought of how many nights and how many books they'd read together over the past year and a half. How many words and stories had they experienced in tandem? How many of them on nights where she wasn't really paying attention and rushed the experience? She didn't rush now, she took her time. Yes, she wanted to make sure they finished the story before Hisao vanished again. But she also wanted to make the most of the moment. She would savour every word, every bit of the mystery and magic of the story, and every giggle it elicited from her son. And as she read, warmth filled her heart. They'd been reading Jack's final quest for a few hours when Mai heard the front door close downstairs. Daddy's home! Hisao jumped from his bed and ran out the bedroom door. Man tried to stop him but wasn't fast enough, so she chased after him. Hisao shouted, Daddy! As she reached the end of the stairs, Hisao hit the last step and ran straight through his father. He turned back, confused. Again, Jin looked up at Mai, then back down at his son. What happened? Hisao asked. Jin looked at Mai. You didn't tell him yet? She shook her head. Tell me what? Hisao asked. He walked toward his father again, reaching out, watching as his hand passed through his father. Tell me what? His voice rose in timbre. Frames on the wall shook. Calm down, Jin snapped. Just calm down. Tell me what? His eyes were wide and terrified. He backed away from his father. And now the chandelier was swinging, not to mention every knick-knack in the living room. It reminded Mai of the stories she'd heard of bad spirits wrecking homes, sometimes even killing people. Hisao looked at the light swinging above his head. What's happening, Mummy? Jin answered instead. You're dead, Hisao. Hisao stared at him. What? Frames crashed to the floor, followed by the chandelier. Hisao screamed, frightened by the noise. The TV hovered a foot above its stand, flew across the living room, then exploded against the wall. Damn it! Jin shouted, more likely out of shock than anger, but it rattled Hisao all the same. You have to stop. I'm not doing anything, Hisao said. Mai ran down the stairs and stood next to Hisao, her hands hovering around him, wanting to touch him, but refraining from doing so. But her presence seemed to comfort him. The shaking stopped. Hisao stared at his father, tears streaming down his face. I'm dead. Yes, Jin said. And your mother is going to call bereavement services today. Aren't you, Mai? She gave a slight nod. Jin turned back to Hisao. Once that's done, they will help you pass. Pass? What do you mean, pass? Get to heaven. No, I don't want to go to heaven. I want to stay here. Mai swallowed the painful knot in her throat, tears streaming down her cheeks. Jin said, You can't do that, Hisao. It's not allowed. Everybody has to pass. No, he screamed. And then he was gone. Jin clenched his fists, squared his jaw. I thought you were going to call today. I'm sorry, she said. We were busy. Busy? Doing what? Reading his book. Jin stared at Mai. He had on his serious look, the one he got when he was angry. God forbid a true emotion be visible behind his facade of control. Reading a book? She might as well have said we're building a rocket in the living room or something equally outlandish. I wanted to read him Jack's final quest book before, you know. Why? Because he didn't get to finish. And it's his favourite series. Jin clenched his hands into fists at his side. Our son is dead, Mai. I know that. No, I don't think you do. Otherwise you would have called bereavement services. You know the longer he waits, the more violent and unstable his spirit will become. I don't believe that. Mai. No, not Hisao. Jin turned away for a moment. She knew he was angry. He always turned away when he was angry, then turned back, pointing at the wreckage. Look around you. All spirits turn, Mai. All of them. The government wouldn't have formed bereavement services to help them pass if it wasn't so. Hisao needs to pass before it's too late. Bullshit. What? He blinked. And she knew it was because she seldom swore. She lifted her chin. It's bullshit. An old wives' tale, designed to scare families into paying for the service. But I don't believe it. When's the last time anyone saw a bad spirit? We don't see them because sensible people call bereavement services. Most people don't allow ghosts to remain in their homes knowing they are about to turn. You make him sound like meat about to go off. Our son is not going to turn. He loves us. Jin stepped over to her, hands waving in the air. You saw what happened, Mai. He broke our TV, the chandelier, the pictures on the wall. He could have just as easily hurt you or me, thrown us across the house like a rag doll. Don't be so dramatic. Hisao wouldn't hurt us. He isn't capable. Jin grabbed her, tight by the arms, and shook her. He's not Hisao anymore. He stopped being Hisao the moment he died in the hospital. Whatever that is, it is not our son. Jin's fingers dug into Mai, his eyes full of rage. Let go of me! She pulled away, stumbling into the wall, grateful for its support. Jin looked away, ashamed. He hadn't laid a hand on her in 6 years, ever since he'd stopped drinking. Mai turned on a heel, made her way back up the stairs and went to Hisao's room. She entered, slammed the door, then locked it. Hisao wasn't there. A moment later, she heard Jin knock on the door. I'm sorry I grabbed you, Mai. Jin sighed on the other side of the door. But we need to finish discussing this. I'm done talking tonight. Another sigh. Then his voice shifted into something sharper. Fine. But I'm calling bereavement services tomorrow. Mai went to Hisao's bed and lay down. She pulled her son's sheet and blankets over her, crying into his pillow. His book fell to the carpet. Day 5. Jin spent almost an hour trying to convince Mai to open the door next morning. When he was officially late for work, he left, telling her that bereavement services would be there at noon. She needed to let them in, allow them to summon Hisao's spirit and guide him to the next. Mai said nothing. Only after he left did she unlock the door and go downstairs. She considered making breakfast, but Mai had no appetite, nor did she feel up to showering. She thought about going on Live Life, but the thought of seeing more phony sympathy only made her bitter. Mai wanted to sit and mourn, and nothing else would do. She got a bottle of water, carried it back up to Hisao's room, then shut the door. If she didn't hear bereavement services knock, she couldn't let them in, right? His book now lay on his nightstand, the edges of the bookmark jutting out from the pages. She measured the width of what remained to be read, about 6 more chapters. Close, yet so far. Would he come back? And if so, would he remember he was dead? Or could they pick up where they left off before Jin ruined everything? She closed her eyes, still tired. Then she woke to movement on the bed. Mai opened her eyes and saw him stretched out beside her, book in his hands. "Mommy, what are you doing in here?" "Waiting for you, we're reading your book." He smiled, probably not remembering he was dead. "Is it my turn?" "It is." She scooted over on the bed and he clambered up beside her. She nestled her head into the pillow as he began to read the next chapter in his Jack book. He was halfway through when the doorbell rang. "No, no, no." "Who is it?" Hisao asked. "Nobody. Keep reading." The doorbell rang again. "Want me to see who it is?" "No," she said. "I'll go. You wait here." Mai got up, went out into the hall and closed his bedroom door. She looked downstairs. There were 2 frosted glass windows on either side of the front door. Shadows of at least one man were visible. The doorbell rang again. Mai wondered how long before they'd give up and go away. Then she wondered if her husband had warned them she wasn't interested in letting them in. He mostly worked with the minister of the state. She was sure he knew people in the bereavement division well enough to inform them of a few particular details, like his wife was having a hard time, which likely meant that they wouldn't go away until she answered. The doorbell rang for maybe the 10th time. And then she saw one of the shadows lean down. Her heart pounded. Surely Jin hadn't told them where the hidden key was kept. But he had, because she heard the sound of metal in the lock. She marched down the stairs and wrenched the door open, startling the 2 men. She grabbed the key from the lock and fisted it behind her back. "What do you want?" 2 men stood in their bereavement blacks, an older bald man and a slightly less old chubby man with a dark beard. The old man spoke. "Mrs. Oku?" She nodded. "I'm Jennings and this is Feldspar. We're here to help usher Hisao to the next." "No, thank you. We're doing just fine." She closed the door, but the old man put his foot in the gap, pushing it open. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but you're required by law." "It hasn't been 7 days yet. You can come back tomorrow." "It's been 5 days, well past the deadline." "No, the deadline is 6 days, and I know the law." 6 days is the maximum amount of time, but we almost always pass the souls within the first 3, Feldspar said. 6 days is unheard of. "But it is allowed." "No, it's not," Jennings said. "That was the old law. We passed an amendment 3 years ago following a particularly nasty incident of an unhoused man who hadn't been tended to in time. He killed 9 people before he was nexted." Mai laughed. "Yeah, right." "Excuse me?" The old man recoiled. "You're lying." He bristled, clenching his jaw. "It's just a scare tactic you all use to justify your jobs. If souls truly went dark in 7 days, I think we'd be hearing more about it. I mean, bereavement services can't possibly help everyone who passes on, right? What about old people who die alone in their homes with no family and nobody notices? What about those living in remote areas? Those who drown deep in the ocean? High on a cliff? In fire? There's no way we wouldn't hear about their ghosts causing destruction. But we don't. We just get random tabloid stories about someone who knew someone who saw a boogeyman. But no real news. So, no thank you. We don't need your services. Keeping your son here is not only incredibly dangerous, it's illegal. And selfish." Mai folded her arms across her chest. "Selfish? How so?" "If your son doesn't pass within 7 days, his soul will never be allowed into heaven." She laughed and rolled her eyes. "Again, more nonsense to justify your jobs." "All the religious leaders agree." "Really? All of them? When they can't even agree on gods or what or where heaven is? Forgive me if I'd like some actual proof before allowing you to chase my son away." All of the major religions are in agreement with the general tenets of this process, Mrs. Oku, Feldspar said. It's not up for debate. For me it is. Then she looked behind them. What are you doing here? Both men turned to look, which gave her the opportunity to kick Jennings' foot from the door. Then she closed and locked the door. She watched them have a whispered conversation, then they both turned and went back to the truck. Mai went upstairs and opened Hisao's door. But the room was empty, the book lying on the bed where he'd been holding it. She swallowed, tears welling as she crawled back into his bed. She waited, hoping he'd return before Jin got news of her refusal to let the men into their home. No such luck. Jin returned 30 minutes later, just as she reached the last chapter of Jack's final quest. Mai! The door slammed downstairs. She considered ignoring him. She could lock Hisao's door and stay in the room. But she didn't feel much like getting up, so she stayed where she was, her back to the hallway. Footsteps pounded up the steps, then the door slammed open. He was breathing heavy, waiting for her acknowledgement. Mai said nothing. What are you doing? Still, she didn't respond. I know this week has been hard, but this isn't up for debate. Bereavement services will be coming. No. Do you realize how this looks to my bosses? To the neighbors? Silence. The secretary to the ministry withholding bereavement services, it's unheard of. It's an embarrassment. It'll cost me my job. I don't care. Silence. Angry silence. How do you see this ending, Mai? His voice had lost any trace of love. He sounded like he was disciplining one of his assistants. You think if he stays here, he'll continue to live with us happily ever after? Why not? If it worked like that, wouldn't everybody refuse bereavement services? Nobody wants to send their loved ones away. Nobody. But it's not for us to say. It's God's will. Screw God. If God wants Hisao so much, tell him to come and get him. But I'm not handing him off to some government soul-crushers. If you don't let them in, they'll come back with police. You'd let them lock me up? Mai sat and turned to face her husband. She was surprised by two things at once. He wasn't angry at all. He looked exhausted, like maybe he hadn't been sleeping well either. And he was crying. It had been years since she'd seen tears in his eyes. Was he finally feeling the weight of his son's death? Or was he merely frustrated with her refusal to give Hisao up? Inconvenienced with how it made them appear to his bosses, to the neighbors? We have to let them in. It hasn't been 6 days. Jin sighed. So which is it? You'll give him up on the 6th day or not at all? Not at all. That's not an option. Then why'd you ask? Damn it, Mai. Why are you doing this? Why are you so eager to let him go? I'm not eager to let him go, Mai. But I want him in heaven, not trapped here forever. Or worse, in hell. You believe in heaven still, don't you? I don't know what I believe. Don't you ever wonder why people started coming back to begin with? Maybe heaven is full, but the government refuses to admit they don't know what's going on. So, they started this bereavement services nonsense to try and get some control. But what if they're not helping people get to the next? What if they're killing souls? Don't be ridiculous, they wouldn't do that. She wanted to continuing argue, but she was exhausted, and knew better than anyone that he would not change his mind. She also knew she had no means to stop Jin from letting bereavement services into their home. He'd simply call the police to drag her out, and even if it didn't lead to her imprisonment, it would certainly be the end of their marriage. No, she had to think of something different. And she did. But in order to execute it, Mai would have to lie to Jin for just a bit longer. She swallowed, dropped her shoulders, turned her head away. I'm sorry, you're right. Call bereavement services. Tell them to come tomorrow at noon. I'll let them in. Silence. A moment later, his hand fell on her shoulder. Are you sure you don't want me to do it? You can go to a coffee shop. No, I want to be here so I can say goodbye. All right. And then something occurred to her. Tell me, she said, wiping tears from her cheeks. Has he come to see you at all? No, Jin said, shaking his head. It was said that ghosts usually appeared to those closest to them, but rare was the occasion where a ghost only appeared to only one person, especially when it was their parents. Usually both saw their children, but Hisao had only come to her. She wondered how Jin felt about that. Did he realize the distance he'd put between himself and his son, both as a tough disciplinarian and as a workaholic? She hoped he felt every bit of his grief. She hoped he was going through hell, and she was about to put him through even more. Day 6. Mai slept in Hisao's room again, and thus was able to leave in the middle of the night without waking her husband. She left a note on the fridge. "Need some time apart. Going to stay with Mom. I'll be in touch. Please don't call." She hoped it would buy her enough time. Mai had a theory. It was a shot in the dark, but if she were right, this would keep her son out of the clutches of bereavement services until after the 7th day, and by then it would be too late to cross him over. And then once they saw they were wrong, and a ghost didn't automatically turn into a violent spirit, they'd have to leave them alone. She texted her mum another message. "Jin's been drinking again. I need a few days away. I told him I was with you. If he asks, please say that I'm there but don't want to talk to him. I'll be in touch soon, hopefully with some good news." Her mother was a 6-hour flight away, and Mai didn't think Jin would get on a plane. And even if he did, her mum had never much cared for Jin. So it's doubtful she would let him in. If everything went according to plan, Mai would have more than enough time to complete her plan. Mai arrived at the Best Stay Hotel, an hour away from her house at 1:30 in the morning. She checked into her room, double-checked her cell phone to make sure it was off with the SIM card removed so that Jin or the police couldn't track her. She'd left her car at home, taking a cab from a nearby diner to a hotel. Then she caught more cabs, bouncing around hotels until she landed at the Best Stay. Earlier that day, she withdrew cash from the bank in order to avoid using her credit cards. She'd even checked in under a false name. Mai placed her travel bag on one of the 2 queen-sized beds, then got into her pajamas. She retrieved Hisao's book, then climbed into the other bed. "Come on, Hisao. Come to Mommy." She lay down and waited. He'd come to her twice before outside of their house. Mai figured he had to have some way to find her when he wanted, and hoped he'd find her here. If she were right, he'd miss the 7-day window and could stay with her for eternity. If she was wrong, then the last time she saw Hisao was likely to be it for good. She feared Jin would somehow be able to summon the boy, then he'd let bereavement services do their thing. "Come on, Hisao." She stared at the book, hoping her boy could hear her, wherever he might be. Mai woke up at just before noon. Bereavement services would be at the house now, starting the process, trying to draw Hisao in. She paced the room, wondering if Hisao had appeared while she slept. She resisted the temptation to put her SIM card back into her phone to check her messages. Had Jin called? Of course he had. He must have. Several times, she'd bet. He probably figured out what she was doing. He was likely angry, demanding she come home to stop this nonsense. Mai could feel his rage, imagine his eyes bulging out of their sockets, his face red, accusing her of damning their son for eternity. Her stomach rumbled. She hadn't eaten in days. In fact, she couldn't remember the last time. She grabbed her purse and keycard, then headed to the door. What if Hisao came when she was out? She made sure he saw the book, then left the room and the hotel in search of a restaurant within walking distance. Maybe a change of locale would draw Hisao out, assuming he'd not already been processed by bereavement services. There were 2 restaurants nearby, a diner and a steakhouse. She chose the less crowded diner. After taking a newspaper from the box outside, she found a seat in a booth in the back. The waitress, an older woman who reeked of cigarette smoke, took her order of eggs, bacon and coffee. "Breakfast for dinner?" "I guess," Mai said, not feeling particularly conversational. The waitress took the hint and moved on. She returned only once, with Mai's plate, leaving her to pick at the food for the better part of an hour. She read the newspaper, but the words kept blurring. Her attention pulled by shadows in her peripheral vision, the sound of a young child, or the occasional loud noise. But none were Hisao. She swapped coffee for ice water and soon enough was headed to the restroom. When she emerged and returned to her booth, Hisao sat there, staring blankly at her plate. She almost collapsed from relief. He was still here. He hadn't been processed. Mai smiled and rushed over, sliding into the booth opposite. Hisao! She kept her voice low, not wanting to draw too much attention from the diners at nearby tables. She wasn't sure if they could see her son or hear him. Sometimes ghosts were witnessed by others, but often not. And she didn't want people to see her talking to herself. There were only two answers if that were the case. She was crazy, or talking to a ghost. Hisao said nothing, staring at her plate with a blank expression. His skin looked less vibrant than the last time she had seen him. "Are you hungry?" He didn't respond. Her pulse quickened, worry bloomed in her mind. Was something wrong with him? Was Jin right after all, that if he didn't cross over before the 7th day, he'd be doomed to become a violent spirit? "Please talk to me, Hisao," she said, worried she'd made a horrible mistake. Still, he just stared at the plate. Mai waved her hand over the plate, obscuring its view. He stared, his eyes not registering her movement. "Hisao," she whispered, fear creeping into her voice. Still, nothing. Mai noticed a pair of police officers sitting at a table diagonally across from her. One of them turned to look at her. Mai focused her attention on her food, wondering if there was some "be on the lookout for her" that had been posted. Were they about to get up and ask her to come with them? She couldn't look. She stared at the newspaper, pretending to read, then stabbed at her food, shoving a cold wad of bland scrambled eggs into her mouth. "Don't look. Don't look." Movement, coming toward her. Her heart in her throat. Then the waitress's voice, "Do you want anything, young man?" She could see Hisao, but he gave her the silent treatment too. "Honey," Mai said, raising her head, "do you want anything to eat?" Still nothing. He kept staring at Mai's plate. His hands balled into tiny fists on the table. Then he started shaking. "Is he okay?" Mai looked up at the waitress. She could feel the cops, both of them, looking her way. "I think he's coming down with a cold." "No," Hisao said, slowly turning to the waitress. "I'm not fine." He stared at the waitress for a long moment, his fists shaking, then the cup, the salt and pepper shakers, and the little plastic box crammed with sugar and artificial sweeteners started shaking as well. Then the entire restaurant started to rattle, and every eye turned to them. The waitress fell a step back. Hisao spoke softly, "And I'm not sick." And then he screamed, "I'm dead." 4 things happened at once. Hisao's scream stretched into an unearthly wail. Every object in the diner that wasn't nailed down or breathing, plates, forks, spoons, mugs, salt and pepper shakers, sugar packets, framed photos, menus, newspapers, jerked up into the air. It happened all at once, as if someone had tossed the planet upside down. Everybody in the place gasped. And then the diner windows imploded, sending shards of glass inward, cutting and maiming, and something hit Mai hard in the head. Mai woke, her vision blurry, and heard crying. "What did I do? What did I do?" over and again. It was Hisao. Mai sat. Ceiling tiles had fallen all around her. She slid out of the seat, moving carefully. The restaurant was demolished. Shattered glass, broken plates, food, bent utensils and other debris littered the place. She wasn't sure what knocked her out. It didn't matter. Her son was staring at her, almost catatonic. No, not at her, behind her. Mai turned slowly, then saw the chaos, the blood. "What did I do?" Hisao asked, now looking at her. She grabbed his hand, surprised that this time they connected. "Come," she said, pulling him out of the booth. But he was froze, so she picked him up, then carried him, past the cop on the ground clutching at his bloody eyes, past the other cop, deceased, a shard of glass impaling his throat, past the wounded, the dead and dying, all of them fuzzy. Mai saw only the front door. She needed to get out of here and back to the hotel before anyone figured out what happened, before more police came and before bereavement services came. She stepped over shattered glass and broken bodies. She reached the front door. It was broken, so she stepped through. The whole time she clutched Hisao tightly, tears streaming down her face. And once outside, she ran. They made it back to the hotel, somehow making it through the lobby to the elevator and finally to her room without being spotted. She closed the door, locked it, sat him on the bed. "What did I do?" "You didn't do anything." Mai looked him over to see if he was wounded. His hair was a mess, but that wasn't the worst of it. Dark circles bloomed under his eyes and his skin was grey. It looked like he was getting sick. Or worse. Can't think about it now. They didn't have much time. Somebody would put two and two together, then bereavement services would come to take her boy away. Or he would vanish. Or do even more damage. She considered getting in the car and fleeing, but the way Hisao looked, Mai didn't know where they could go that wouldn't invite unanswerable questions. The police and bereavement services would both be looking for her. For them. How long before her name was plastered all over the news? How long until the authorities found them? What had happened? Her Hisao would never hurt people. She didn't think he meant to do what he had at the diner. But it was becoming clear. He was going to change to a bad spirit. And there was nothing she could do about it. Was it too late for Hisao to get into heaven? Or had she damned him for eternity? Mai couldn't think about it now. Hisao was shaking, his teeth chattering. "I don't feel good, Mummy. Where's Daddy?" "I'll call him." She grabbed her phone from the nightstand, returned the SIM card, then texted Jin, telling him where she was. "I'm sorry, please send them to the hotel. I will let them in." Then she set the phone down. "Daddy will be here soon. Let's finish your book." When she went to join him on the bed, his eyes were closed. She shook him gently. "Hisao?" "Mum?" He sounded confused. When his eyes opened, they were glassy. Was he slipping away? Did souls slip away even if nobody came to guide them into the next? "Do you want me to finish the story?" she asked. "Yes," he said, smiling. She cuddled up next to him, pulled the blanket over them both, and began to read the final chapter of Jack's final quest. He leaned against her, his head on her bosom, looking at the pictures. She turned the page to the last drawing, Jack lying on top of a hill with his friend, Edward the unicorn. Both of them staring up at the stars in the sky, talking about the endless possibilities stretched out before them. There were only 2 words left. The end. But she couldn't bring herself to say them. If she did, she knew her time with Hisao would well and truly be over. Hisao sniffed. "I'm going to miss them so much." Hisao was fading. She kissed his head, her tears falling. "Me too, son, me too." A knock at the door. Was it time already? "Is that Daddy?" Hisao's eyes were barely open. He struggled to sit up. "Let me see." She got up, went to the door and opened it. Jin was there, alongside Jennings and Feldspar. Jin looked at her. His eyes widened. "Mai?" "Yes," she said, confused as to why he was looking at her like that. Jin looked past her, over to the bed where Hisao was barely awake, smiling. Hisao whispered, "Daddy." Jin looked back at Mai. "What happened to you?" He reached out, but his hand went right through her. Mai stepped back, confused. She reached out to him, but her hand did the same. Then she looked down and saw the blood staining the front of her shirt, a deep cut, from the implosion at the diner. "Not you too." Jin's eyes welled with tears. Feldspar stepped forward, putting a hand on Jin's shoulder. "I'm sorry, sir." I woke to the smell of cherry blossoms. She was in a bed she'd never seen, in a room that wasn't hers, though it appeared oddly familiar. It was a boy's room, with posters of dragons and knights on the wall. A blue bookshelf was lined with colourful spines, boasting titles both familiar and foreign. The odd angles and contours of the room and its furniture, the ball on the ground, the oversized shoes. Everything looked like a drawing come to life. A cool breeze blew the curtains open. She caught a glimpse of an impossibly twisted tree trunk just outside her window. Blue and yellow leaves glistened with morning dew. The door to the bedroom creaked open and Hisao came in. "You're awake," he smiled. "Where are we?" Her head was dizzy and nothing made sense. Yet Mai felt certain it was all about to. "It's best just to show you." He took her hand and led her out of the room, through the living room, which also looked vaguely familiar, like more drawings come to life. Where have I seen this before? He led her to the front door, and then she saw it. The bright purple sky straight out of Hisao's book. And in the distance, on a hill, she spotted a boy chasing a unicorn. She squinted, hardly believing her eyes. Then she turned to Hisao. He smiled. "Everything is going to be okay, Mom. We're safe now." Mai smiled back at him, finally feeling like yes, everything was going to be okay now.